Hello and welcome. Welcome to Input English. This is a very different episode today. You might call this a walk and talk. This is a discussion, actually a monologue since I'm the only one talking. This is an experience walking and talking. So it's for the same purpose. That is, this is comprehensible input. But I've tried to make this an interesting visit. As our channel has evolved, I've gotten a lot of comments in the comments section, and one of the recommendations that was made many times actually was that perhaps we should have some videos that are longer, that have more language, so that people can get more time in contact with the English language in one episode. So this is a response to that recommendation. This is actually very much in line with content that I consumed while studying Spanish, because some of the podcast episodes and videos were more than 30 minutes long. And, you know, for people with a short attention span, that's a big problem. But for a focused language learner, it's actually a great benefit to have one episode that continues in a logical sort of way over time. So that's the purpose of this. That's the background. This is actually being made in response to recommendations in the comments. A couple of things you might notice. This is being made in a selfie stick mode. And you can see I have a hat. And if you look at the hat, it has a crow on it. And I bought that hat in Utah at a place where we were exploring the canyons of Utah. And I thought it was pretty charming. I always enjoyed crows, and to have one on my hat just sounds like fun. So now let's give you a glimpse of where we are, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do here. You can see behind us our destination. We're on the campus of Stanford University. We're in Palo Alto, California, and we're at a road, and I need to cross that road to get to the entrance of the place where we're going to hike. So here you can see behind me the entrance, and this area owned by Stanford University is open to the public for hiking. It is maintained as a wilderness grassland, as habitat for a variety of plants and animals, and it's quite the place to visit. Okay, so we have entered into this trail. This area is called the Stanford Dish. So let's start defining our terms so you know what we're going to show you. Stanford Dish. So a dish. So the Stanford Dish is a radio telescope. It was built under contract from the Air Force, and it was put into operation in 1961. So it is more than 60 years old. The Stanford Dish was no ordinary radio telescope. It had some very interesting characteristics that were built into it because of the requirements of the Air Force. This was built by our Defense Department, and they had specific things they wanted to do. Now, when I was growing up, if somebody said a telescope, they were typically referring to an optical telescope, and it was something through which you looked to see things far away, to magnify distant objects, such as the moon or planets or stars. So we grew up understanding optical telescopes. So this idea of a radio telescope was quite an interesting concept. It was also disappointing to the child in me because it didn't generate pictures that I could interpret by looking at them. It generated images that were blobs and different colors, but not very satisfying. That said, radio telescopes provided a lot of benefit to humanity to understand a lot of things around the universe. Radio telescopes are large reflecting dishes that capture a signal, a weak signal, and focus it on a single point so that it can be amplified electronically and then interpreted, analyzed. The shape of the dish is parabolic. It is 46 meters in diameter, 150 feet. So if you understand radio telescopes, they gather weak signals, radio signals, they focus it to a point, they amplify that signal electronically, and then it can be analyzed. Perfect. So that's a radio telescope. But this device that they built here on this campus has a feature that is actually the opposite of that. One of the features they built into this telescope is it can transmit. Right. It can transmit. Now, who do you want to transmit to? Who is your recipient of this signal? What's going on here? They created an amplifier for this radio telescope called a klystron transmitter. It's made with giant vacuum tubes, very old technology, and a pretty powerful transmitter at that. And they wanted to be able to transmit signals. And the only thing out there that, assuming that we're not talking to aliens in faraway places, the only thing we would be communicating with would be satellites, spacecraft. And that's exactly what this was all about. We wanted to be able to send signals to spacecraft. That came into use during the use of this device, this Stanford Dish. So we have discovered one of the interesting characteristics of the Stanford Dish, and that is it can transmit as well as listen. Well, a lot of this information has come out over the decades because this was a device built by our Defense Department for defense purposes. And more recently, it has been discovered that one of the purposes of the Stanford Dish was to collect and analyze radio signals that originated in the Soviet Union, but bounced off the surface of the moon. We wanted to know more about the radar in the Soviet Union. So that was one of the known purposes of this device, was to analyze radar signals bounced off the moon from the Soviet Union. Let's give you a look around here. So this is Grasslands on the hills. The trees are mostly oak trees. The grass is all dry, very dry. So fire would be a risk. As we step over here, there is a weed growing, and you can see that weed behind me, right down here. And to my eye, I think this weed is called tarweed. It has a very aromatic, smell. It's very sticky. And it grows during this very dry season. We're coming up to a hilltop, and it is my suspicion that this will give us our first glimpse of the dish. So far on this walk, the one thing we have not seen is the Stanford Dish. It's the name of the locale, it's the purpose of the walk, and yet it's not in view. So this may be our first chance to see it. Now the Stanford Dish is easily seen from the road. As you drive on the freeway, for instance, Interstate 280, one sees the dish sitting up on a hill easily. So we are now at a little intersection in the trail with a road, and there is your first view of the Stanford Dish. Now we're going to get much closer as we progress on our walk, but as predicted, this is our first time to see the dish. Okay, I have stopped on a hilltop because this is a great vantage point to see a number of things, and I can show them to you. So you can see we're still on our path. The dish is off in that direction. We're going to get closer to it as our walk progresses. Now beyond the campus here, you can see a large flat area that looks like water. Well, the reason that looks like water is it is water. That is the south end of the San Francisco Bay. Today is a clear day with skies that are best described as mostly cloudy. And when you say mostly cloudy, that means that more than half of the sky is covered with clouds. And it sounds really dreadful until you get down to the details. These clouds that you can see, and I'm going to turn so you can see the clouds, these clouds are cirrus clouds. And cirrus clouds are not made up of droplets of water, they're made up of crystals of ice. And they can be assumed to be more than 20,000 feet up. It's all ice crystals. Now, mixed in with the clouds, you can see some lines. For instance, that one right there over my shoulder, you can see a line, and that is a vapor trail. Now in the Bay Area, you see a lot of vapor trails, so let's define our term. When a jet engine, any engine, but in particular jet engine, burns fuel, the combustion products of burning jet fuel would be water and carbon dioxide mostly. So the water is discharged as water vapor, but the water vapor exits the engines at very high temperature, but it enters an atmosphere of very cold temperature because it's more than 20,000 feet up in the air. And so the water vapor turns into small ice crystals, and we see that as a vapor trail. So if somebody says, I see vapor trails, they're talking about the water condensate, in this case ice crystals, up at altitude created by jet engines. Vapor trails were normal throughout my entire life. We saw them all the time, and for the most part, we didn't take much notice of them. They were just part of the normal course of events. And then they disappeared. Now, the reason they disappeared was the 9/11 attacks, because aviation in this country came to an abrupt halt when the 9/11 attacks occurred, and there was no aviation going on. So for a period of time, there were no vapor trails. It was an extraordinary change for most of us who were used to seeing them throughout our life, and then all of a sudden they were gone. Well, now they're very much back. Okay, we have progressed a little bit further in our journeys, and I have run into something I did not expect That's kind of normal for me to find something I don't expect. And let's show it to you. So the first thing you'll see over my shoulder will be hard to see, but down here over my right shoulder, there are a couple of buildings and there are a bunch of radio antennae. And then here, you can see a radio tower. And on the top of that tower, there's an antenna. There are a whole bunch of these antennae. These are radio antennae typical of shortwave radio, typical of amateur radio. So in the United States, certainly there are radio stations that broadcast programming, music, talk, a variety of commercial radio stations, but there are also amateur radio stations, and they are on bands within the radio spectrum. Okay, so we have arrived here at our destination, and there's a lot to talk about. So the first thing that's super easy is over to this side and on the ground, and you can probably see a series of parallel structures, and then on the end of it you can see this triangular structure. And this is a structure used to prevent cattle from crossing this line. So ranchers in the United States and everywhere have this interesting problem that you want to control the movement of cattle, and they tend to do it in the States with barbed wire, but then you've got this problem with gates and the requirement to get out of the truck, open the gate, go through the gate, close the gate. And so the solution here is a cattle guard. And this is used on roads and small roads, big roads. So a steer, any kind of cattle, will not cross this because their hoofs will not be able to handle these gaps between the rails. And they know that, so they will not try. So this is essentially a 100% way of stopping a cow or a steer from going from here to the other side of that fence line. The next thing to show you is here beyond this fence line, and you can see that the grass has been mowed down or cut down, and that was actually made with a farm implement called a disc or a disker, and that is a fire break. And that is an illustration that the managers here put great value on the radio telescope, and so they don't want a grass fire to sweep in and destroy it or damage it, so they have these fire breaks. A lot of municipalities have requirements for fire breaks. Other times fire breaks are put in out of prudence by the landowner to protect a structure. That may be what's at work here. Now let me turn and show you the Stanford Dish. So that is a parabolic radio telescope. It is 46 meters across, or 150 feet across. The mount is called altitude azimuth mount. That is, it rotates around the compass rose, and then the elevation, otherwise called azimuth, is adjusted on the perpendicular axis. So having arrived here, it brings up an interesting philosophical discussion about destinations versus journeys. So we have taken a walk that so far has consumed more than 2 miles and has brought me to this place, which you could reasonably call a destination. But the question arises, was this walk only to see the destination, or was it really of value as a walk? In other words, was the journey, was the travel itself a large portion of the value that one would place on this trip. And I think that is the case. I have to admit, I was brought up very goal-oriented, very destination-oriented, and as a youth, most of the places I walked to, the goal was to get there, and once you got there, you would take a snapshot, you'd take a photograph, document that you got there, and then you'd split, you'd take off. And the problem with that is a big part of the enjoyment of this trip is the journey itself, not just that brief moment of seeing the Stanford Dish up close. One of the uses that the Stanford Dish had was communication with spacecraft. Now, this dish that you're looking at right there in the video is owned by the United States Air Force. It was built by the Air Force on contract, and they spent in 1960 about $5 million. So if you translate that into 2024 dollars, it's in excess of $50 million, about 10 times more. And then you could say, well, it would cost even more than that because the technology has changed, and a lot of the technology and manufacturing processes that are currently used are intrinsically more expensive. So there is not a prayer you could build this for $5 million or $50 million. This would probably cost $250 million to replace if you had to replace it. Now, admittedly, you wouldn't replace it with old technology. You would replace it with newer technology. So this device has been here, operated by the Stanford Research Institute since it was built, and it's operated on contract with the U.S. Air Force. Some of the things that are publicly disclosed about the function of this radio telescope is it was used to communicate with Apollo spacecraft during the Apollo series of launches that resulted in a dozen men walking on the moon. This dish was one of the ways that NASA had to communicate with the Apollo spacecraft. It was also used to communicate with Voyager and a variety of other spacecraft over the years. Now, if you're interested in the Stanford Dish, there's a lot of information publicly disclosed on the internet, and YouTube is one of your big sources. There's a really charming YouTube where one of the content creators made contact with the staff of this research institute and arranged to enter the facility and make video footage inside the radio telescope. It was fabulous. So you can find that on YouTube. There's nothing secret about it. So I would submit that we have had a wonderful walk, that the walk is at least as valuable as the destination, and yet I was able to show you something that I find at least very interesting. So now we are more than 1.5 miles from the car, and so I need to continue on my journey. There is no taxi service, there is no bus, there is no tram. I suppose if somebody got into trouble, they could call 911. There's a cell tower in view, so cell service here is almost assured. So I'm sure you could get help if you were stranded out here and needed to be rescued. Overhead, there are a couple of black vultures, and they're soaring. They're not flapping their wings very often. They tend to just soar. The cliche in American culture is you don't mind seeing vultures in the air unless they're circling directly above you over a long period of time with the implication that perhaps the vultures know something about you that you're not aware of yet. It's a joke. So this wilderness area, this grassland, is under the stewardship of Stanford University and some volunteers who work here. These folks are not exactly hands-off. They are trying to foster a healthy ecosystem, but they're not just letting nature evolve without any help. So this is an example of the help that is being given here. So this is a plot of little shrubs that have been planted. This is monkeyweed, which is described as a local native plant that used to be quite plentiful here and is now in decline. So this little plot of monkeyweed has been planted. You can see evidence of individual shrubs that have been planted and watered and shepherded so that they will develop, because they're trying to reintroduce this species of native plant back into this ecosystem. Okay, we've made a circuit. It is the whole loop, and you can see over my shoulder the entrance whence I came, and the parking lot is beyond that. So we're all set here. This long walk is done. This has been delightful. I could not have been happier with the weather. I could have been happier if I'd brought some sunscreen, but at least I had the hat. So this is a new format for us, as I said at the outset. This is a long format. Going forward, if you like this format, I'll make more of them. I hope you like this episode. Please leave comments below, and please come back and join us in future videos. See you soon.